I'm going to talk a little bit today about our methods and our experiences for working with interdisciplinary collaboration and communication. And I'd like to start with a little story that may or may not have happened about a young woman who graduated in the teeming metropolis of London as a primary school teacher. And her very first job that she got was in the sheep rearing valleys of Wales. It was a very different environment for her. And on her very first day in the school, she had a classroom full of 7-year-old children. And she thought she'd go quite easy with them and gave some flashcards where they had to respond what was on the flashcard. And she put up the flashcard of the tree, and they all responded that it was a tree. She put one up of a car, and they responded car. And when finally she put this up, there was complete and utter silence. And she was thinking of all the places for them not to know what this is very strange. And she was cajoling them, saying, come on, you know what this is. And then finally, from the back of the class, a very timid hand goes up and asks, is it a border Leicestershire? Which is a very specific breed of sheep. Now, you could argue that she should have known her audience better, but for our sakes here today, it's more to do with the fact that they were experts. They were experts in one thing, and that was sheep and sheep breeds. And if perhaps this class was in the Amazon, they would have been trying to identify what the tree was, or in Detroit, many years ago, the car. And so they could not see when a sheep was just a sheep. And if you think about all the different ways of interpreting a sheep, it becomes a little bit more complex. Sometimes a sheep just needs to be a sheep. If you think about all the different disciplinary endpoints to that one object, it gets extremely complicated. Right now, there's around 400 disciplines in Denmark's universities. That's a hell of a lot of experts out there. And they're all experts mainly in one thing. So there's a lot of semantic confusion. It's almost axiomatic that there will be more and more complexity, and as disciplines grow in complexity and specialization, the ability to communicate outside one field of knowledge, it reduces. So each discipline is like a separate language, and more areas within the field become different dialects. So what do you do about that? And we maybe should go back to medieval Mediterranean. When there was a burgeoning trade, there was a lot of ships going from land to land, from island to island, and trade was really beginning to develop there. But as they went further afield and as they captured more and more slaves from different countries, they had a linguistic issue where it was absolutely impractical for them to be able to speak each language with each trader and with each slave. So over time, they developed a very, very simplified language through which they could communicate. And this was a Lingua Franca, which was using different types of words from different languages that they came across in a very simplified grammar. So if we define a Lingua Franca as a language systematically used to make communication possible between people not sharing a mother tongue, in particular when it's a third language, distinct from a mother tongue, we're suggesting within disciplines we should have a visual Lingua Franca. Just using visuals to make communication possible between disciplines. And that's what we're going to try and take a look at now. I'd like to give you some inspiration about how this has been done in the past. And this is the first person we look at. Surprisingly enough, we don't think of Florence Nightingale as a visual pioneer, but in fact, when she was in the Crimean War, when she was a nurse in the Crimean War, she was one of the world's greatest statisticians. And she kept copious notes about each of the soldiers who were admitted to the hospitals and how they got admitted and what they were suffering from. And she learned something very, very important, and that was that if you were living in the slums of Manchester at the time, you were twice as likely to survive until the next day than the average person who was in the Crimean War. And it wasn't through dying from war, it was from preventable diseases. And there were huge numbers of people. But the problem was that the person that she needed to communicate this huge issue to was Queen Victoria, who wasn't very accommodating to reading hundreds of pages of bare statistics. So she invented a whole new way of communicating, and it was known as the Cockscomb Diagram. And if you look at it now, it looks pretty modern. This is from 1858. And we can see what she's done here is she's tried to go through time from July, August, September, October, November, December, and then on to the following year. And then she has marked out in the area the ways in which people are dying. And the small red areas here are people dying through battle, and it's tiny. And these blue areas here are from preventable diseases. So in an instant, you can see where the problem lies. And she brought back this, and it was presented in the House of Commons, and eventually, of course, to Queen Victoria. And suddenly, they were able to instantly see the impact that it could have if they changed their system and the way that they dealt with the soldiers as they went to war. And this has had a complete revolutionary impact on how soldiers are treated to this day. Then on to an engineer around about the same time. He's not so famous for his engineering projects. He created what was possibly the greatest infographic of all time. And when you look at it, it doesn't look like much. But when you start to read into it, you can see why it's loved so much. And this charts Napoleon's campaign to Moscow in 1812. And how it works is it's going from west to east geographically here. And then the width of this line, this beige line here, represents the number of troops that were marching. So they start off very happily here as 420,000 fit and healthy soldiers. And then up north goes an auxiliary team here, 22,000 of them. They keep marching eastwards, another auxiliary group. And as you can see, as they progress, the line is getting thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner as they battle their way through. When they finally end up in Moscow up here, there's only 100,000 left. And then the optimistic beige turns to deathly black as they march backwards. And down here, as they march backwards, you can also see the temperature as they march back and the drop in temperature. And you can see the impact that that has as they get there. Round about here, you can see this is a river, and there was a major stampede, and there was half of their troops died just here. This river, depending on which language you speak, either means a very, very good thing or a very, very bad thing now. You can also see the auxiliary crew have come back to join them, and then they arrive until they are just 10,000 people at the end. So it's a huge amount of data, of different types of data in one very simple infographic. And it's even moving. It's even quite emotional when you look at it from that perspective. And finally, this is how the London Underground map looked like in 1913. There's a huge amount of information in it, but it's very, very difficult to see what's going on. Everything is absolutely true to the geography of medieval London. But of course, this is the part that's most interesting for most people when they're trying to get from A to B in the center of London. Every time a new station came, they had to actually reduce the size of the center so that they could fit the new town and the new station that was being built outside that. So things were getting smaller and smaller and smaller within the map. And it took somebody outside of this geographical discipline, an electrical engineer, a draftsman, working with the London Underground at the time, to be able to see that maybe there's another way of doing this. That if you think about people's journeys, they're not that interested in the geography, they're more interested in the connections, they're more interested in how to get from A to B. And so they simplified to magnify what they needed to know, and this is what has ended up. So the geography has been thrown away. The geography was not important. Once you're inside the system, you no longer need to know the geography. And this is being used everywhere today, and it has never been thought of before up until that point.